Okay, so we are in the chapter on federalism. Last time we were looking at this slide right here, which is out of your book, right? Remember the green column over here are the enumerated or listed powers of federal government, and then the denied powers of the federal government. The yellowish column over here on the right is the powers reserved for the states, and then the powers denied for the states. And in the center are powers that are shared, right, that both federal and state can do on their own authority or shared between them. So both can collect taxes, both can borrow money, both make their own sets of laws, right? The state laws can't directly contradict the federal laws and can't try to limit the federal laws, but in areas where there aren't federal laws, the state laws can certainly be made. And in some places, there's limitations on the federal government, and the state law gets the authority to make the laws there. They can both charter banks and corporations, right? So you can have federal banks, you can have state banks, right? That's what we're talking about there. Eminent domain, right? The taking of property for public purposes, right, is also there. So these are some places where they both have powers that you can point at as things that they can exercise. And that's where we stopped last week. At the end of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment is sitting there as a kind of backstop limitation on federal power. Remember, our framers were concerned that they were giving up an awful lot of the state powers to the federal government so that it could have the power to do things and be effective, but they didn't want to just give them a free rein on anything. And the 10th Amendment is there to try to provide a limitation on the growth of federal powers and to ensure that what powers the federal government was exercising were ones that had been duly designed and set up for the federal government. So the 10th Amendment tells us that powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the state by the Constitution, right, are reserved for the states or to the people, right? They're not sure, but what they're saying is whether it's going to be exercised by state governments or it's going to be exercised by the people as liberties on their own. The 10th Amendment is here to say that it will not be federal power, right? So it's trying to set up a way to try to limit the growth of federal government over time. And it means that if the federal government is going to grow, it has to grow within the arenas of their constitutional and then congressional legislative powers that they have already there. So it's trying to say that if we haven't thought of something, we haven't specifically talked about something, that's not going to be available for the federal government. What we have experienced over time is that in the places where maybe constitutional or congressional legislation at the federal level and the states and their exercise of power, where the two might cross paths, might lead us to having a debate over which applies. Generally speaking, we've come down on the side that federal practice and federal law, especially if it can be directly looped back through the Constitution, is going to be the supreme law, right, over the state law. So we've through practice, through court cases, we've seen that the federal government gets to lock down some of its powers, and it has grown a little bit through this, right? The first historical event that kind of demonstrates that for us is a court case, McCulloch versus Maryland. So what we have here is a federal representative, McCulloch, in the state Maryland, having a lawsuit against it, that the state brought against the federal government. What had happened was the federal government had set up a national bank, and it had located that bank in Maryland. And in Maryland, right, the state government was thinking all banks in our territory should be subject to our regulation. And they wanted to tax that bank, essentially. And the administrator of that bank saying, I don't think so. We're a national bank. We're not a state bank. You don't have authority over us. And so we got the lawsuit to figure that out. And what essentially the court tells us is while there's nothing in the Constitution that says, right, as an enumerated power, the federal government has a national bank, right? They said that it's an extension of an implied extension of the powers given to the federal government through the Constitution, because the Constitution does say, right, that the federal government has the right to coin money, right, and the right to tax, and a bank is kind of necessary or implied element of having taxation and coining, right? You're going to have a bank to put your money in after you coin it, a treasury, something, right? And so the court looked at this and said, look, it's not enumerated, it's not a listed power, but the listed powers that we have for the federal government sure do need a bank for them to make sense, right? And so they came up with this thing saying any power that would be implied by the enumerated powers, right? In other words, if it has to kind of be there to make the enumerated powers work, it's assumed that it's there. And this is, right, certainly an argument that can be challenged and was challenged. But at the Supreme Court level, they made the decision, right, that these implied powers were necessary to be able to exercise the enumerated powers. What this automatically does, right, is make us question how strong the 10th Amendment is when you've got the 10th Amendment saying, hey, if we haven't said anything about this, that it belongs to the state or the people. And then the Supreme Court says, well, sort of, but also if the enumerated powers need that, then we're going to say that this power is elastic in its ability to stretch around the needed exercises and give that power to the federal government. So the state lost the federal on that challenge to federal power. The Supreme Court said, right, that this is going to be the supreme law of the land. Now, the interesting part here is that part of what's happening in this case is not just that the court is telling the state, hey, right, you can't exercise this as federal powers, but the court's also saying, hey, as a federal court, we're the authority in making this decision, and we're saying. And so that's a bit of an interesting kind of thing that's going on there as well, right? That you've got the Supreme Court kind of putting this idea that they're the final review on this constitutionality of this question. So that was a kind of watershed event historically, because, right, we had a direct conflict fairly quickly after, right, the implementation of the second Constitution between state powers and federal powers, and this elastic clause came out there that said implied powers are proper, and there's, right, if we exercise something under that venue, then it's going to be considered supreme, right? It's national law. It's going to be over state. So that's one event that kind of drove home where federal power is sitting and being used, and the states have to accommodate themselves to it. The second one is the interpretation of the Commerce Clause, right? The Commerce Clause is telling us that the federal government has, right, the ability to act in areas where there is interstate commerce. And it also, right, we've got, right, intrastate commerce reserved for the states. But what that means, right, here for the federal government is anytime you can demonstrate that commerce has crossed state lines, then it is subject to federal regulation, subject to federal oversight. So that's a pretty broad reading that is, in a sense, throughout the history now of the U.S. led us to the position that almost all commerce is interstate anymore, right? It's very hard to find intrastate commerce. And so interstate commerce, right, is subject to federal regulation because of the ability to say, well, did all of the materials you use to make that originate within your state? No. Well, if any of those materials you use to build that come from across the state lines, then the federal government's got a regulatory interest. Did all of the investment that was made into your business in your state come from within your state, or did it cross state lines? Right. So the idea here is you're looking at this full, extensive background of transactions to figure out if something is interstate or intrastate. And federal power has been argued again and again to be extended over this interstate exercise, because as time has gone on and as our economy has developed, almost everything is interstate, right? In our finances, in our economics, in our market. So the fact that our economics are international, global, right, and across the country in itself puts the federal government in a lot stronger position to regulate the economic commerce of the country. Does that make sense? All right, let's move on to the last two issues here that we've seen drive federal power down into the states. The Civil War obviously is a huge historical moment in the exercise of federal power over state powers, right? You have the states in the southern right section of the country and up the East Coast seceding from the Union, building their own national government. But the federal government and the northern states are, right, obviously interested in preventing that secession, saying that there's not a right there to break the country up that way. And so, the Civil War itself is right, this conflict that comes about because of that. The resolution of it, though, is what we're actually interested in here, because with the federal government, the Union Army winning, the results of that are to forcibly bring the southern states, right, into the Union to the decade after the Civil War, so through Reconstruction, to regulate the states and a lot of their exercises in the South to ensure that they're following the guidelines, the principles, and the edicts of the federal government. And all of the southern states, right, got new constitutions after the Civil War. Those constitutions, right, brought them back into the Union, dictated what was proper action as far as elections and civil rights and individual rights, the rights of citizens, right? All those things were dictated because that's what the point of the Civil War was over. And so, as the victors, the federal government wrote the rules in that and instituted those rules in the South for over a decade. And of course, the upshot of that is that right, the federal government, right, is ensuring that the states, through Reconstruction as a result of the Civil War, are ensuring that those states in the South follow, right, and step back into the Union the way they're supposed to, driving home again the idea that federal power, in a lot of instances, is going to be where it's used properly as supreme. When Reconstruction was over, the federal government pulled out of the states and left the southern states to work forward on their own. There was immediate backlash. There was immediate recession back toward the states running things the way they wanted to, not necessarily in line with what the federal government had in mind. Making the civil rights movement in the 60s necessary, right? And a lot of the things that were being done in the civil rights movement in the 60s, the Voting Rights Act, right, Civil Rights Act, were essentially trying to still enforce, right, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments in the southern states, right? They had fought that and slid backwards in their legal their legislation, right, that was being written at the time, and U.S. citizens, right, people of color that were U.S. citizens were not able, as U.S. citizens, to exercise their rights, to vote, and be treated fairly and equally in the South. And so the federal government, through legislation, is trying to recognize, right, the goals of the civil rights movement and try to make this work again, right? So that's in the early 60s to the mid 60s that we're doing this, right? We've got the federal government bringing National Guard into the states to enforce civil rights legislation. We've got quite a few showdowns between states leaders and federal leaders about implementation of proper voting procedures. We've got the Supreme Court again and again, right, ruling that how elections are supposed to be operated in the South. We had the Justice Department was responsible for making sure that the elections in the South were being held correctly, and that individuals had the opportunity to register and to vote without being impeded by other folks. And we're still fighting a lot of those same issues today. And so, right, like we're 60 years past the civil rights movement, and we're still, right, got a lot of these issues that we're having to deal with that aren't settled yet, and that we're not ensuring that U.S. citizens are getting fair and equal treatment as U.S. citizens across the states in the U.S. So it's not a settled issue. What did get settled out of it pretty much is that the federal government has the authority to enforce those standards, to make the states follow those standards, to try to make that happen. Again, so these four events, while they're not always successful in the subject or the policy that they're pushing, what these events are showing us are examples of where federal government has held to be supreme to, right, over arching civil state governments. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to change topics, right? Now, we've been talking about the supremacy of federal law over state governments and state law. What we have also, right, is that there are obligations, right, in the Constitution that exist between the states. So remember, federalism is, right, the extension of power over the same people in the same area by multiple governments. And so the federal government has some things to say about how the states treat citizens of other states and practices of other states. So what we have are three places where there are obligations that exist between states and between their governments. The first is referred to as full faith and credit clause. It basically tells us that, for example, the state of Texas must honor other states' public acts and proceedings. So what that means is if you're married, right, to your significant other, you go, you're in Vegas and you're having a good time, you decide to get married, right? You go to the little white wedding chapel and Elvis marries you, right? And you're married legally in the state of Nevada. And you come back to Texas, right, after your vacation and your wedding and you've had a good time. When you come back to Texas, you've got a document, right, that, or you've got one soon from Nevada saying that you're are now a married couple. The full faith and credit clause says that Texas will honor that public act, right, that proceeding, and that your marriage in Nevada will be considered an official legal marriage in Texas. Okay? So anything that is being done that way in one state, right, carries its legal effects over into other states. And this is important because the states have different laws on these things. And for example, prior to the Supreme Court case that legalized same-sex marriage in the United States, each state had their own approach to who could get married to each other, right? So I think if I recall correctly, Massachusetts is one of the first states to legalize same-sex weddings. Okay, so we had folks right from Texas that wanted to get married. They went to Massachusetts. They fulfilled the obligations to get married in Massachusetts. They did. They eventually come back to Texas as married individuals. And the law in Texas is, sorry, you're same-sex, you can't be married. Well, full faith and credit from the federal position said, sorry, they got married legally in the state of Massachusetts. You have to honor it. Right, so Texas would have it because we were further back in the process there, right? We would have to honor that those people were legally married, even though they couldn't have gotten legally married in Texas. This used to happen quite often for things like real quick marriages. A lot of states used to have waiting periods and blood tests, and it could take weeks to get married in some states. But then you'd have a state like Nevada that said, hey, you got the money and we've got a witness, we can take care of that right here, right now. And so people would literally fly to Vegas to get married and then fly home, right? Because it was quicker than waiting to get married in the state that they lived in. And that let them circumvent all the laws that, say, Texas had in place about the process of getting married and how long it was going to take and all of that. Didn't matter, right? Once they got back to Texas, they had met all the qualifications in the other state. They were legally married in that other state. Well, they're married in Texas too. So it's honoring those public acts, those proceedings that happen legally and lawfully in another state carry their weight here. Which is why, right, you get a driver's license in Texas. You don't have to get one the minute you cross over into Oklahoma and then into Kansas. And right, that driver's license issued to you in Texas, even though we do it differently than a lot of other states do, gets you, right, is honored when you go to a different state, even though you may not have taken the same test, driving test or paper test or whatever it might have been. They're going to say, okay, what you did in Texas is good enough here because you've got that license from Texas, and right, you're legal to drive through, right, to be here for a short time on that license. Notice though that, right, if you move to a different state, you're going to have residency requirements that require you to get a new driver's license in that state, and you may or may not have to test to get that new driver's license in that new state, because at that point, right, you're now starting to work as a citizen within their state, and you've got to follow their laws. So that's what the full faith and credit clause is all about. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? All right, let's move on to the next one, which is the issue of extradition. Extradition is the practice of sending someone that's been accused of breaking the law in another state, and you've got them in your state. Your extradition is the practice of sending them back to the state where they've been accused of breaking the law to stand trial. What this is meant to do, of course, is it's meant to nullify state boundaries as an opportunity to escape, right, the application of the law when you break it in another state. So you can't break the law in Oregon or something and then run to Texas and go, hey, I'm in a different state. You can't arrest me. What I did for Oregon, right? The answer to that is if Texas becomes aware that you have been accused of breaking the law in Oregon, and Oregon is asking for you to be sent back, Texas is obligated to send you back. Give me a little more context here, Charles. So how does this apply to Julian? I'm not cluing into what you're asking me about. Julian Assange. Oh well, he's out of the country, right? So Julian Assange, right, is founder of WikiLeaks and is considered to be a wanted individual by the United States. He, right, was it Ecuador? He was in the embassy in for Ecuador and Great Britain, I believe. And I think I may be wrong about Ecuador, but it's some South American country that we do not have an extradition treaty with. And because we don't have extradition treaty with them, they're not obligated to send them to the United States, even though we want to put him on trial for breaking the law here. If we had a treaty, right, in place between the countries that recognized extradition, if they wanted to preserve that treaty and that position with the United States, they'd live up to it, right? But we don't have that treaty. And so as long as he stays, and I believe he's wanted even in Great Britain he's wanted in Switzerland or Sweden on a charge for sexual assault or something. And if he steps out of the Ecuadorian embassy, Great Britain has an extradition treaty with Sweden or Switzerland and would, right, pick him up and send him there. So he's, right, got to be very careful if he decides to leave the Ecuadorian embassy, which is, embassies are generally considered to be the ground that they're on, the property that they're on in that country belongs, although, right, the Ecuadorian embassy is in Great Britain. The treaty between the countries says wherever your embassy is considered homeland, right? It's considered Ecuador. So if you're inside the embassy of Ecuador, you're technically in the legal boundaries of Ecuador, and that applies, right, for us as well, right, where we have embassies in other countries. If you're in the embassy, you're on U.S. soil, and it gives you protection, right, from other countries' governments if you can stay in your embassy. And that's what he's doing, right? He went to an embassy. They granted him the ability to stay there. And as long as he's there, he's outside the legal reach of the U.S. or Great Britain or Sweden or whoever. Our extradition clause that's here, right, that exists between the states makes that impossible in the states. Right? States have to honor it. So there's no ability to hide, right, within a state, like Julian Assange is hiding in Ecuador. So you didn't change the subject. You're right on top there. That's a good question, Charles. How that usually works is, and I'll give you a real example from Texas, and the reason I picked Oregon earlier, right? We had an individual in Oregon that was accused, I believe, of murder in Oregon, got away, ended up being in Round Rock, Texas. He committed a murder here in Round Rock, and state of Texas got him. Well, when they arrested him, right, one of the things they do is they look to see if he's wanted anywhere else, and they're, right, as Oregon saying, we want him, right? We want him for murder. And so the state of Texas is obligated to contact Oregon and say, hey, we got this guy. And then they talk about what they want to do. And Texas is, if Oregon says we want them and we want them right now, Texas is obligated to send them right back. If I recall that case correctly, Oregon said, oh, you've got him for a murder charge too? Well, why don't y'all try him first? Because if y'all decide to execute him, we don't want him back. And so basically they let us decide what we were going to do. Now, if we charged him with murder and found him guilty of murder and decided to put him in prison for 12 years or 15 years or 20 years, whatever the case may be. Oregon may also say, okay, send him up here once you've sentenced him. We want to try him too. And then they decide where, right, say if they found him guilty there as well, they'd negotiate where he goes to jail, right? So, it just, the negotiation is there between the states after the fact, but the extradition is an obligation that exists between the states. Now, most of the time, right, if it's really small time stuff, it's not going to be an extradition issue in that sense. They're not going to put you on a wanted list to be extradited back, but if there's a high-level misdemeanor or a felony, it'll happen, right? So if you've got outstanding speeding tickets that you haven't paid in New Mexico, you probably don't have to worry about that until you're back in New Mexico. Just because it's so petty level, they're not probably going to mess with it. Okay. Any question on the extradition thing before we move on to privileges and immunities? All right. So this one is kind of a reverse of the first one, right? The first one is full faith and credit. You go do something legal in state, right, X, you come back to your state, it's looked at as being legal. Here, the idea is that when citizens of another state are in our state, that our government and our procedures treats them generally as if the same way that we treat our citizens. Right? We're not going to single out, right, citizens of Oklahoma that are visiting in Texas and mistreat them because they're not Texas citizens, right? Except around the Oklahoma Texas football game, and that might be a little different. But other than that, right, if you're right in Texas with your Oklahoma plates and your Oklahoma driver's license and you're driving down through Austin, right, we should not have our police forces out trying to give you tickets for everything in the world just because you're from Oklahoma, right? We should treat that car and that driver as if they have Texas plates and a Texas driver's license. They should get the same benefits as Texas citizens, generally speaking, right, as they're passing through the state or here visiting, that we would give Texas citizens. So we shouldn't be making them a target. This is not carte blanche. It doesn't apply to everything. If any of you are out-of-state students, right, your residency is in another state, and you're going to school here in Texas, you're getting charged much higher tuition fees than Texas residents are, right? You're not getting the privilege of being a Texas resident, right, while you're to use Texas education institutions. And that's been tested in court a few times on this issue. And the argument simply is that Texas residents have been supporting the institutions through their taxes and fees and things like that, even if they haven't been going to them for a long time. Whereas a citizen of another state that moves down here specifically to go to that education institution hasn't. And so there's a discrepancy about there in the support for that system. So some examples are made that way. We do that at ACC, right, between whether you live in an ACC tax district or not. Right, if you live in an area, the city limits that has voted to be part of the ACC taxing district, in other words, all the property owners in that city pay a small tax to ACC, right, and then ACC comes and builds a campus in your city. You will pay a lower tuition fee than if you do not live in an ACC taxing district. And if you live outside the tax district, you'll pay a higher fee. So it's the same thing going on inside Texas, right, as the Privileges and Immunities Clause, right, works between the states. So the idea here is that we extend privileges and especially immunities, right, criminal immunities, to citizens of other states while they're in our states. We treat them the same way we would treat Texas citizens. We don't single them out. And it works in most instances, but it's not, right? It doesn't apply completely across the board. And schools are one of those exemptions or exceptions to that rule. Does that make sense? Any questions about that one? All right. So we've talked about federal supremacy over state laws in some places. We've now talked about obligations between the states that have to be met based upon their laws. Now we're going to actually talk about how federal law and state law kind of work together. How sometimes, right, one directs the other, right, and in other times they work together and they cooperate. When the Constitution, federal Constitution, went into effect, the perspective of how the relationship between states' powers and federal powers and how they work together, the perspective that was in place was what was called dual federalism. And that chart kind of shows you that, right? I'll back up to it real quick. That chart kind of showed you that, right? A little further back than I thought, right? These are state powers reserved for the states. These are powers denied to the federal government. These are powers reserved for the, right, they're enumerated for the federal government and denied to the federal government. So, right, when we're talking about a dual federalism, we're talking about these powers being federal, these powers being state, and not really a lot of overlap there, right? We're kind of expecting both of those governments to operate in areas in their spheres of influence and to do what they're supposed to do. So the perspective on that would be what we call a layer cake, right? The right, federal government, top layer, state government, middle layer, local governments, lower level, and they're separated, right? There's a distinct arena that belongs to each one. And so the layer cake is your kind of image example of what we're talking about when we talk about dual federalism here, right? Right. Follow these levels here, right? Same kind of idea. And when we, right, this Constitution went into effect, and for a good long while, that layer cake or that dual federalism was the perspective of how this was supposed to work, right? Federal government stays in their place, state governments kind of stay in their place, and they operate the power as they need to within those. Over time, right, the middle ground, the places where we have concurrent power, and then other places, right, it became, right, efficient for the federal governments and the state governments to begin to share power, to begin to work together. So think about something like this, right? In the early 1950s, in the Eisenhower administration, right, the idea of building interstate highways was being developed and put into place. And we started building interstate highways to cross the United States. Well, the federal government doesn't have, right, the road building capabilities to build the interstate across the United States, north or south, east or west, right? But a lot of the states do, right? The states have a very extensive road system within their states. They've been building roads, maintaining roads in their states for 100 years. So it makes a lot of sense if you're going to build an interstate highway, maybe for the federal government to come up with the organizations of doing that, most of the money to help do that, and then to hand the implementation of that actual development of the interstate highway off to the states to let them manage the actual project, right? And so we see this development from dual federalism to a more cooperative federalism, where we're starting to see the governments, the federal governments and the different state governments work together, right? Sharing power and getting more done because, right, you're looking at this interstate highway and there's a federal need for it, maybe, military distribution, But then there's also the benefits that have come from interstate highway inside the states, right? The economic benefits. So they're like, yes, we would like to see this happen as well. We can pony up some money. We can pony up, right, some people, some skills, some right, and we can work together. And obviously, if you're going to be building something like an interstate highway, you're going to be gathering land, and eminent domain will be exercised by both federal and state governments to gather the land necessary to build these interstates. So cooperative federalism is the next stage that our federalism kind of morphed into over time. It moves from a dual cake situation or layer cake situation, dual federalism, to cooperative federalism and a marble cake, right? And so the marble cake here, right, this is kind of the old bunt marble cake approach, right? And you see here the insides are not a clean, distinct layer like we had over here. There's a lot of mixing going on, a lot of kind of confusion or between what's going on here. And this is right, but been very useful for us over time, right? We've got it a lot more done, a lot more effectively and more efficiently when the governments are working together. So this is right where we were since the 50s. You can describe us this way. It's actually become a little even more definable than just a marble cake or a cooperative. It's actually become much more easily identifiable as what we call fiscal federalism today, which is federalism that rotates around the spending of money, federal monies, at the state levels a lot of times. So what you're looking at is, right, the federal governments have the ability to tax in the states. They have the ability to do within the states. The states also have the ability to tax and spend. Those two things together means that they can work with each other, right, with tax bases and then with funding amounts to get things done. And a lot of what we do today, the federal government extends its power over the state governments, voluntary kind of arrangement. What happens is the federal government says, we would really like to see this occurring in your state. And we're going to make money available to all of the states to do this. Now, the federal government doesn't have the authority to force the state to do that, but they're putting money out there for the state saying, hey, if you might want to do this and would like to do it the way we want it done, we may pay for it, right? And so in that sense, they're extending federal power by putting this money out there to entice the states to take it and do the actions that the federal government would want. Now, again, the states, it's completely up to them in these cases to take that money or not. But if they want that money, then they have to apply all the regulations that go along with getting that money. Right? So this is fiscal federalism, and this is how the federal government can extend its power without there being a challenge on whether it legally has the ability to operate there or not, because it's not making the states do anything. It's giving them an opportunity to do what the federal government wants if it corresponds with their same ideas. And so we see this quite a bit dipping down into the states. The actual way that this money percolates to the states is through either categorical grants or block grants, right? And this grant money is something that the states are generally looking for, right? If say in Texas we wanted to extend or expand the training that we give to our police officers across the state of Texas, we don't have the money to do it. There might be grant money in either a categorical form or a block form sitting at a federal level saying, here's money to spend on police training in your states. You can have it if the training we're wanting to give our police officers is pretty close to the training the federal government's wanting to see our police officers get and are willing to pay for, happy days for everybody, right? We go apply for that money, and if we get it, we spend it on what we want. So on that training. So the way that's set up by the federal government is either through a categorical grant or a block grant. And a categorical grant, which is most of the grants that are coming out of the federal government for states to pick up on, are grants that are saying, here's money that's available to be spent in this area, and here are the rules that apply to it. And out of all of the monies that are available for grants from the federal government to the state government, about 80% of them are set up as categorical grants. Those categorical grants are broken into two more types, a project grant or a formula grant. Let's talk about those real quick. They're pretty easy to understand. I don't have a slide on them. Easy enough, I don't need a slide for them. A formula grant is where there is a federal formula that sits out there and says, you as a state, if you want to do this project, you want this money, we will give you this money based upon a formula. So let's say the federal government tells each state that there's $50 million available to each state to be spent on IT projects for higher education. And COVID hits and ACC is trying to figure out how can we get more internet access to our students that don't have access to it. And we look at the federal government and we see a grant there that says, hey, here's money for IT projects. If you'll build out your Wi-Fi, so it'll have a bigger platform for students to get available, we'll give you money to do that. And we're going to base that on a formula. So based upon how many students you have, we'll give you $1,000 for every student. So if you got 40,000 students, here's $400,000, go build your system, right? The formula dictates how much money ACC would get in that situation, or the state of Texas would get in that situation, right? So there's a formula there that decides that. The strings that are in place for the program apply, right? Whatever those strings are, right? So the state, through ACC, through the state, has to implement this project and meet all of the goals or the strings that are tied to this project at the federal level, but the amount of money they're going to get is determined by the formula that's in place. Usually, if it's going to be, say, a health and human services project that applies across the state, it'll be based upon the number of people, residents of the state, right? So you got 20 or 8 or 30 million people in Texas, we're going to get money, right? $1,000 for every person, right? Whereas Louisiana, say they have, I don't know how many they have, but say 3 million people, they're going to get, right, a lot less money, but they're going to get the same amount for those 3 million people that we get in Texas, but we'll get a bigger amount because we got more people. So it's per capita in a lot of instances as a way to apply for like that. So in those instances, the states look at it and say, yes, we'll follow those restrictions that you have in place, or that guidance that you have in place, that administration that you want, and they'll know how much money they're going to get because of the formula. The other kind of grant that's available under a categorical grant is a project grant. And project grants are basically the state pitching a project to the federal government, right? Money set aside for projects, say, in law enforcement. I actually pitched a law enforcement project one time and got federal money through the state government. So I've done this. And the project I pitched was training for law enforcement officers, online training for law enforcement officers. And what we wanted to do was put a website up where law enforcement officers could log into the state's website for training for police officers. They could take that training online free of charge. We provided the online content. All they had to do was log in and take it. So we went to the governor's office with our project and we said, here's what we want to do. And the governor's office said, hey, there's project money available for law enforcement training projects from the federal government. Let's bottle this up and make a pitch to the federal government, right, to the administration. And if they like it, they'll okay the money you need to do this. And so we said we need $2.5 million to do this. We wrote up the project proposal, the bid. Governor submitted it through to the federal government. The federal government said, sounds good. Here's your money. Go do this. And here's what we want out of the back end, right? We want you to give us reports every quarter telling us how you're making progress. We want to know when you've completed it. We want to know how much training you deliver. We want to know what that training's worth in real dollars to the police agencies. And so we basically just had to fill out reports to justify getting that money. And we built online training for police officers, spent the money, went into place, was saving about $15 million a year in state funds, spending $2.5 million of federal funds. They liked our project, they gave us the money. So that's how that works. And in that case, the strings attached were negligible, right? Minimal. They might be a lot more intrusive, right? We have monies that are given out, and this is actually an example under a formula grant, but it's the same thing, right? In the strings or the requirements element, we get money in the state of Texas from the federal government every year to help maintain our interstate highways. Right now, those highways are built. Right, the state of Texas is responsible for ensuring those get maintained. We usually pass that down to the county level, and the county puts out bids to road construction companies in their county to maintain that interstate highway that goes through the county. The state of Texas gets money based off a formula, how many miles of interstate highway are in the state of Texas, right? And you get a set amount for each mile, and then we spend that. Okay, so great. We've got the interstate, it's built, we're getting money every year or so from the federal government to maintain it. And the rules are in place, make sure you use proper counting methods, make sure you keep the roads fixed at this level of quality, and you're going along your merry way. A couple years down the road, the federal government decides, you know what? It's in the national interest that we limit the maximum speed limits on the interstate highways to 55 miles an hour. So if you want to keep getting this federal money to maintain your interstate highways, here's a new requirement. Lower your speed limits to 55. Okay, so that's where some of this can become problematic over time, is that if those strings change. And so you're accustomed to budgeting this money that you're getting every year from these grants, and you're meeting the obligations, and then the obligations go up, right? And then you have to decide as a state, do we want the money bad enough to lower our speed limits, or do we tell them keep their money, we'll figure out a way to keep these interstates maintained ourselves, because it's important that we keep a speed limit in Texas higher than 55. Could you imagine trying to go across the state of Texas on I-10 at 55 miles an hour? So, and this is not a maybe kind of situation. It's actually happened. It's real circumstance, right? When we had oil embargoes and oil shortages in the 70s, we lowered the national speed limit on interstates to 55 to save oil, save fuel. And most states just did it, right? Because they wanted to keep that money. They didn't want to be seen as going against the national idea here of trying to be thrifty in the use of fuel, blah, blah, blah. And so they did it. But not all states, right? Some states, Montana, if I recall correctly, said, no, I don't think so. Right? It's not quite as far across Montana east to west as it is Texas, but it's a long way. And there's nothing out there, and we're not going to slow down. And so for a few years, they gave up their money, their maintenance money from the grants, and they did it on their own. What they had thought they were going to be able to do was fund that maintenance through higher ticketing, right? Speed limits, and keep the speed limit where you want it, but get out there and enforce it a little harder and raise money through tickets, a little revenue that way. It didn't actually replace it, and they started running out of money, so they eventually lowered the speed limit. So those are project grants, right? You bid a project. If the government likes it, they say yes, and they supply the money. Formula grant, right? The monies that are made available are based upon a formula, so there's no, we need this much. It's here's how much is available. So that's categorical grants. The second grant there is called a block grant. Most of the grants that are done, most of the monies that are spent through fiscal federalism are done through the categorical grants, not the block grants. But block grants are things that we really, really like at the state levels because they come with very few strings attached. It might be something like the federal government says, okay, we're going to give $100 million to every state if you will, right, use it to enhance education at the K through 9 level, K through 12 level, right, primary and secondary schools. And Texas is looking at it and going, the only string on this is that we have to spend it on education between primary and secondary schools. Okay, give us the money, right? Because there's no real oversight there. That probably all you're going to have is some reporting that tells them, here's where we spent it, so that they know that money went to where it's supposed to go, and that's it, right? And so that's looked at as just kind of a gift in that sense. And so block grants are a lot easier in that sense, right? A lot of times, right, it's just money, federal taxes made available to us as grants to come back to the states with a little bit of target on where they go. So states like those. I already mentioned the strings attached to, say, project grants and formula grants. The actual term we use there are mandates, right? A string that's attached is called a federal mandate. If you spend this money, if there's a mandate to do this action, right, whatever it might be. And that's usually not a problem at the inception of a project grant or a formula grant, right? Because you're looking at all of the mandates that are in place at that time, and you're saying, yes, we can live with that. The problem is, as I've explained, right, states get dependent upon that money, they budget it in, and the mandates might change over time. And as those mandates change, maybe the federal government gives you more money to cover the mandated change, right? Keep doing what you're doing on this project from A through C, but here's D and here's extra money. Do D now too. Okay, that's not what we really wanted on the front end, but you're giving us money, we'll keep doing it. You're giving us extra money. We may find out it's not quite enough, but we don't want to give up all the other monies we were getting, right, that were tied to this. So we'll find the funding on our own, right? So it may be underfunded, or it might simply be a new mandate. You want to keep all this up, you're getting to do this also. Somebody got your mic open? I think I'm getting some feedback right now. So, right, those unfunded or underfunded mandates can be a problem going forward. What was I going to say about that? I think that's about it. I think I had one more point I was going to make, but I'm not remembering it at the moment. So states, right, are basically acquiescing to the extension of federal power through all of these grants down into the state levels by taking the money and by, right, choosing to go along with the requirements that the federal government puts in place to have this money. So we've seen a lot of extension of federal power into the states level over things that would normally be states' purview to make decisions on, policy decisions on their own. But if they start taking monies from the federal government, then the federal government gets to have some say or some dictates into what they do there. We saw this in a big way under the Obama presidency when the federal government, Congress, and President signed into being the Affordable Care Act, which then became known as Obamacare through the media. When that legislation was signed into law, right, the bill was passed by the Congress and signed by the president. One of the elements of it was that if you would, right, if the state would choose to implement a lot of these processes that were in the Affordable Care Act, and it was up to the states in a lot of these cases to do that. Not all of them, but in a lot of them, the states could choose whether they did or not. You would get up to 10 years of federally funded Medicare within the state, right? So for 10 years after you accepted a lot of this, the federal government was giving the states money to pay for it. Some states, right, took that money because they had people that needed a lot of help, and they didn't have a way to help them, and they wanted to. And so they took that money, knowing that 10 years in, maybe things might change. Maybe the federal government says, okay, we've paid for it for 10 years. We're not paying for it anymore. You've got to pay for it. And so, right, they knowingly stepped into that saying, hey, we'll take that chance, right? We believe that in 10 years, right, the federal government will keep funding this, or at least most of it. But some looked at it and said, no, we're not going to do that. And we know that by saying that, we're going to lose, right, this opportunity for this kind of money to spend on our citizens, right? Texas was one of those states. And what a lot of the legislators in Texas were concerned about was what happens at the end of this 10-year period. And will Texas be on the hook for this money? Because once you put that health care out there that's paid for through that program, in 10 years, are you going to be able to say, okay, well, the federal money run out, you don't get the health care anymore? And so for some folks, the idea was it's better to not ever have it than to have it and have to take it away from people when we can't afford it later on. And this is a real concern in Texas because Texas has a balanced budget requirement in its constitution. And, right, if we accepted that, we'd be put in the position of, at 10 years out, having to come up with a way to pay for all of it or say no to all of the citizens that were now dependent upon it. And so Texas said no on the front end, which has real detrimental effects on people that need, right, that health care. But, right, Texas is a state that wants to pay for things as they're moving along and not run up a huge debt that it can't manage. So, the balancing there, the arguments there are ones that we as Texans have to be engaged in. But Texas was afraid of the mandate changing, and they were also afraid that the federal government 5 years in, 6 years in, might add more requirements, and that this would give the federal government too much power on how things are run in the healthcare systems in Texas, right? In the hospitals and the insurance systems and the Medicare and Medicaid. And so, right, those are typically areas where the states exercise their powers, and Texas said, we're not going to take the money. And so we're doing without, trying to make things work without that. This is a little chart, or a little kind of pie chart thing that's showing you, right, federal grants. It's on Medicaid, right, which is federal aid to the states for medical issues, right, where that's being spent, right, and so all of the grant money that's being spent, the federal grant money that's being spent to the states, about 2/3 of it comes through Medicaid, right? So it's health and human services kind of stuff, right? I mean, out here on the other side, it's income security and transportation, education, right? But most of it is healthcare stuff, right? And so a lot of the federal government, right, spending in this area is spent on healthcare into the states, and with that comes all of the mandates, regulations, or strings, right? That says if you want this money, and there's an awful lot of it, right? You got to do these things to get it. So this is how fiscal federalism works, and the result of this federalism in this sense is to extend the authority of the federal government down into the states, right, as they become dependent upon the monies that the federal governments are getting them, right? It's not a violation of states' authorities because the states opt into it. The states take the money, and they take the obligations with it when they decide to. But there it is. And I believe that's the last slide for this chapter.